Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, I should say. And thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Elliot Olson. I am the Trans, Intersex, and Nonbinary Program Officer at the New Haven Pride Center. Now, before we begin, I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge the land on which we are hosting this event and on the land that the New Haven Pride Center was founded and continues to operate on. We are on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pagusset, Niantic, and Quinnipiac peoples. Please, if you have a chance, take a moment, acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you occupy and the history of the place that you are in. You can learn more about Native lands if you follow the link posted on the screen here, native-land.ca. So, welcome to New Haven Pride Center's continuing programming for Trans Week of Awareness. All week long, we've been bringing you events, panels, art exhibits, much more. That's after celebrating our 25th anniversary this last Saturday or Sunday. Now, Trans Week of Awareness leads up to Trans Day of Awareness on November 20th, where the Pride Center, along with many other co-sponsors, will be hosting a vigil for those lost during the year to violence. Trans Day of Remembrance is a time to mourn and be with community, and I hope that you might make it out and join us on the New Haven Green at 3 p.m. on November 20th. So let's get into today's topic. We will be talking about self-care, taking care of yourself, and also mental health as it relates to the trans community. We will be talking with some amazing panelists in the trans community about the work that needs to happen to make mental health services more trustworthy for our community specifically. And we're also going to be talking about the impact that the world around us has on our mental health daily. We have three incredible panelists coming to us from distinct medical fields. So let's introduce them. First off, we have Kirill Staklo.
Hello, thank you for having me again. Good to be back.
Thank you so much for joining again. Just to let our audience know a little bit about Kirill, he's a peer support programming specialist with expertise in LGBTQ plus peer support. I apologize to the audience for my very bulky dog. He also does crisis support and suicidology. He's the founder of Peer Pride, an all trans majority BIPOC peer support and equity consulting organization. Before working with Peer Pride, Kirill spent 6 years volunteering, working at and directing the International Trans Hotline, a Trans Lifeline. And now he has moved on to create his own organization and make the world that much brighter for us trans folks. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Elliot. Thanks for doing all this amazing work all week.
Oh, yeah. Next up, we have Heather Kim. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Of course. Just to let the audience know, again, Heather is a non-binary child and adolescent psychiatrist specializing in working with trans and gender diverse youth. They've been involved in health justice advocacy since medical school and work to provide gender affirming LGBT inclusive psychiatric care. I know academic interests, social psychiatry, medical humanities, and the history of medicine, especially from like a historical materialist perspective. And I also know that they live in Boston with a cat and many plants. So I'm hoping at some point there might be like a cat walking through the background. Last but very much not least, we have Lauren Millard. Hi.
Hello.
Thanks so much for being here. So just to let our audience know, Lauren is a cis woman, clinical social worker in a private practice in Connecticut with an MSW from Smith College School of Social Work. You've worked in a variety of settings, right? Including adult mobile crisis, PHP, IOP eating disorder programs, inpatient psychiatric units, and outpatient therapists. You work closely with providers in the queer community to further awareness, competency, and access to affirming care, throughout the state. Connecticut native. Thank you so much for being here. I know that we're going to have a great conversation.
Thank you.
So let's dive right into it. I was wondering, now we're kind of talking about two distinct things here. We're talking about the mental health care complex, right, as it impacts the trans community specifically. But we're also talking about self-care and self-awareness for trans individuals when they're understanding how to address their own mental health. So I suppose starting with more the industrial side of things, especially with all of your experience and professional knowledge, I was wondering maybe what specific mental health struggles do you think trans people face that some might not be aware of? And I will say specifically, I'm thinking a little bit about minority stress and chronic, not to say, it's just the trans community, but it's not something that's talked about a lot, I think, or recognized. And please feel free to jump in.
So I think a large issue that doesn't get addressed is the presence of eating disorders. A lot of people, understandably, if they don't have access to things like affirming care through hormones, they'll start to try to adjust their body through manipulation of food. And you need training to talk about that as a mental health professional. It's not something to sort of just muddle your way through. And so I think there's a lot of well-meaning people who never even ask about it.
Mm.
So a lot of like screeners and things like that, they're made for a lot of cis white people, and then just basic needs stuff. I think we need to take a look at our privilege sometimes and talk about basic needs like just safety. There's violence in any community. And I think violence in the queer community, sometimes people think the queer community is all one big happy family. That would be great. But we have domestic violence in our community just like any other community.
Heather, Kirill, do you have any other thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, that's such a broad way to start the conversation off, because I mean, there's a lot, right? Like just by the fact that you're a marginalized, stigmatized group, especially if you happen to be a trans person of color, right? Like you're hyper visibilized in like lots of different ways. You're subject to, police brutality, like just police harassment. You may be like subject to harassment at work and not have like appropriate labor protections. And even just like the framing of like the mental health struggles that trans people face, like I think at least like my immediate go-to as a clinician is like, oh, like trans people don't have appropriate gender affirming healthcare. we're kind of made invisible in the medical record. It's really hard for us to get like our names changed in the medical record without having legally changed our names or gender markers or whatever. But even that is like coming to a subset of the population who have access to healthcare at all. And because we live in America under a for-profit capitalist healthcare system, that's people who have health insurance like at all. And we know that like communities and like queer people are much more likely to be uninsured. And then these people are just like completely cut out of the conversation. So yeah, I mean, just even starting from like basic material needs, like the bottom of your pyramid of pyramid of needs, like trans people just face marginalization at like every level. So I feel like that was enough rambling for me.
No, that wasn't rambling at all.
Yeah, no, I was definitely going to touch on the ED situation. That one's very big. I think like Heather and Lauren covered a lot of what I was going to say, but maybe what I'll add is the unique trauma that comes with like medical trauma as a trans person specifically. And if somebody has, for example, a mental health struggle that's completely unrelated to dysphoria or unrelated to anything to do with like a trans experience, there are going to be traumatic experiences that come with attempting to get any sort of treatment or any sort of care around those mental health struggles, not just from medical professionals too, but also there's some unique things that can happen when you're trans. And for example, when you're a minor and you're presenting with other mental health struggles. So for example, I was supporting at one point, or I was reached out to for support by a family who believed that it was fully normal and not abusive at all for their child who is very young and autistic, whenever their child would quote unquote act out or act in a way that their parents didn't want them to, their parents would bar them from accessing their gender affirming clothes. And they thought that by doing so, they would create an incentive for their child to behave in a way that was holistic and that was expected of them. And they did not consider this to be child abuse. They considered this to be very normal and positive disciplinary action. And this is something that we see across the board with a lot of the time families exacerbating existing mental health issues and exacerbating trauma by treating affirmation as if it's something that can be given or taken away. And that was an extreme example, right? But that happens in a lot of varying degrees in other ways where we do not talk about rejection of a child's identity and this type of conditional affirmation as child abuse. And we don't even talk about worse things as child abuse or as traumatic inherently often enough.
Well, and one thing that comes up for me as you say that, I would say I can't even think of a single person I have worked with who has experienced the Connecticut DCF system as a trans individual and come out without trauma. I've had clients who had DCF workers tell them to not disclose their trans identity because then they won't get a foster care placement. That the way our DCF residential system works, group homes are male or female. There's no either or. And it takes a lot of fight and honestly money if you have access to it. The audience for DCF, DCF is the Department of Children and Families in this state. And honestly, I'm very concerned because I don't know if anyone else saw, but True Colors fully dissolved. And that is really concerning. I've talked with a director of foster care at a private agency who was like, well, the biological parents don't agree with using those pronouns and names, so we are not doing it. And there's very little recourse. And I think part of the issue in Connecticut is we can't put the burden to protect a kid on the kid to advocate for themselves. That's not okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and adding to that, I see so much like violence against, like going back to my earlier example, like neurodivergent kids in the foster care system, the DCF system, like the combination there. And even treating neurodivergence as if it's like a problem to be dealt with in the first place, like the family that I described is just atrocious. Yeah, with True Colors, that's a really great example, or I guess awful example, whatever you might want to call it, of what happens right when there isn't clear community oversight over the work of an organization that very much monopolizes a certain type of work in the state. um, you know, like there's True Colors is just one example of an organization where trans kids did not have good experiences and were harmed, right? But there was no alternative. So hopefully, I think right now, like we as a community can learn about creating alternatives that are actually community run and that have accountability and like are thinking of trans youth in a way that cares for them.
That kind of brings me to a thought, right? Because if you're having biological parents who are disagreeing with the fact that trans people can be trans, and so obviously, aren't allowing certain steps to be taken to protect the rights of that child, if I could be so bold to say.
Mhm.
It makes me wonder. Many people consider transness itself a mental health issue, and it's still coded that way for insurance purposes, as I would like to tell people again and again. But nevertheless, if especially with all of your fields, if someone came to you and was like, "Yep, transness itself is a mental health thing," how would you respond to that? Um, say the parents, right, who don't want to use the right pronouns. How would you even begin to have that conversation between mental health and identity? Again, I know, Heather, I see you like kind of laughing at me, and I know you said at the beginning, you're like, that's such a big question. So I'm like, I'm asking an even bigger one now.
I feel like this is kind of the bread and butter though. So it's there's no great answer for this one either. I guess that's what a psychiatrist says all the time. But so when people point to the diagnosis of gender dysphoria in the DSM and tells me, why isn't it, like, how can you say that, this isn't a mental illness? I usually point to the fact that because the DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association, which is, as is in the name, it's American. A part of keeping a diagnosis at all was like highly linked, as you mentioned, for insurance purposes, because in the US, for a doctor to see you, for a doctor to prescribe you anything, for you to get gender affirming surgeries, like there has to be a billable code. And, if we lived in a society that had a different healthcare structure, that had a way for trans people to receive care without the stigmatizing diagnosis, like that would be great. But like in the interim, it was a kind of a pragmatic decision to change it so that the focus is on the person's experience of distress rather than like their gender identity itself being the pathological thing. And even within the field, I feel like I see more and more people coding for like other things. So like not putting the diagnosis of gender dysphoria at all. Or putting it only in like letters specifically meant for insurance, so that like that's the only place that like it gets coded. And I know like I have the pretty explicit conversation with patients, like patients and families, that like the increased rates of psychiatric comorbidities that trans and non-binary people have are due to the societal discrimination and the overall stress of living in our society, which privileges and kind of normalizes cis hetero identities over all others, rather than there's being something pathological inherent to being transgender. When parents say that they don't want to use the kid's pronouns or names, that's a really long conversation depending on where the parents are. It's almost like motivational interviewing. Like, you're kind of laughing, but it's
no, just from understanding, like,
because it's like you can, you know, really push hard, but then like there's a lot of resistance, and especially in the beginning when parents are going through their own process of grief, no matter how like odd or bizarre that sounds, I try to come at it with like the perspective of like, okay, like surely you want the best for your child. And there's a lot of just psychoeducation on how much affirmation from families and family acceptance improves like health outcome rates. Like it decreases rates of suicide by a factor of, 10. So not to make it sound like emotional blackmail, but like if you don't want your kid to feel like they want to die every day, like it helps if you use their pronouns and names, and like, oh my gosh, like what a great place to start. But that usually occurs on a scale of fastest is weeks to hours to weeks, and longest, months to years. And then during that time, you're also doing a lot of support for the patient themselves and trying to see like where else is an affirming environment for you, like who do you have around you, who else do you have for support, like is there a queer community that you can connect with.
So sort of piggybacking off of that, I was going to mention like the Family Acceptance Project has done a whole lot of work on this, and I think that's actually the evidence for why this is actually a public health issue. If you're coming from a conservative perspective, if you want to reduce mental health costs, affirm people. It's so clear cut. Things get better the minute you affirm people. And it's interesting. I have a family friend I grew up with who's a nun, a little bit of a radical one, and made an extremely good point. The Catholic Church has been renaming people for thousands of years, and nobody's had issues with that. So why can we like say, okay, someone takes a vow and now we call them a new name, but if it's related to gender, that's not okay.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that a nun said that too.
I know.
Yeah. I don't know. Did you want me to respond or no? Okay. I guess I don't know how to answer the question about what would I say to a family, because I'm notoriously harsh. And it's worked, but I have had conversations with people about like unpacking why there's so much emotional investment in an assumption that you made about somebody before they could tell you the truth. And when it comes to gender dysphoria as a diagnosis, everything that Heather said is 1000% true. And also, if people are very emotionally invested, like themselves, in understanding, like a lot of trans people will be like, oh, like, why am I trans? Like, what's going on, et cetera, et cetera. I want to have a diagnosis. I want this to be legitimized. There's a lot of complicated things that we can have to unpack there. But one of the things that comes to mind for me that's a useful analogy to draw is if something traumatic happens to you, right? And you have a response to that, like you can get a PTSD diagnosis, whatever. A trans person being assigned the wrong thing at birth and then being treated the wrong way for X many years, and then after they come out, is its own traumatic experience and results in dysphoria. It's not something inherent to the person. It's a traumatic experience that person had, that in that context, I can understand there being a diagnosis. But the problem with that diagnostic component is that it's treated as if there's something inherently wrong with the person. And, we're going to mitigate harm by, I guess, conceding to affirm this person, rather than understanding that society making assumptions about people at birth is in and of itself wrong, should be avoided, and we need to move away from that. So a lot of the time we approach the affirmation of trans people from the wrong angle, rather than thinking like, does this person deserve this? We should be thinking, why did we do the wrong thing in the first place? Both as a society and also as a family. And ultimately that's where I want to get when I work with families, is understanding that, your child deserves to have the right to self-determination, and they always had that right. And the sooner you recognize that, the better your relationship will be.
Absolutely. I think really understanding that whether you know it's a trans youth or an adult, you are the authority on your experience and who you feel as a person and what your lived reality is. And especially with youth, that's really not understood whatsoever. It's more just like the world is what I tell you it is. And you know, if you don't agree, then I don't know, you're grounded. I kind of feel like not really switching, but I feel like an evolution of what we're talking about right now is maybe, you know, okay, so maybe we've convinced this person that transness isn't a mental health issue in and of itself. But this person responds, even if that's true, I've heard that a lot of trans people are like very prone to mental health struggles. And, they're, while they might not have a mental health illness in and of themselves, there's a little something shaky there. I was wondering if maybe, that piece of misinformation we could dispel a little bit, because I am really into myth busting, before we kind of transfer over to some self-care tips and especially navigating mental health structures and facilities.
So the question is like, oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
So I can find the specific research, but very simply, that's an effect of not being affirmed. That's not an effect of being trans. I can find the research that supports it, because once you affirm someone, most of those factors go completely away.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, at a place I used to work, there was an unpublished secret stuff. It's not secret. It was fine. Survey that was done, a trans mental health survey, that interviewed over, let's see, it was over 8,000 trans people across the U.S. And one of the things that I found that was really interesting is that there is no increase in like new suicidality after a person comes out as trans as compared to before. So talking about suicidality, that's one thing, right? And then we know the 65% reduction in suicidality around youth having the right name and pronouns used. We know all of that. We also know that the statistics and the experiences around trans people experiencing like completely other forms of violence and problems and discrimination, like living in poverty, like dealing with violence, like dealing with discrimination, that has nothing to do with their own experiences of dysphoria or moving through the world. It has to do with how other people treat us, right? That is going to layer on more and more and more propensity towards mental health struggles. And we cannot ever divorce those external experiences. And so you were mentioning minority stress, right, before. And that's what that is, right? As a person who is marginalized, as a person who is disenfranchised, we are going to have experiences that layer on that stress and layer on those quote unquote risk factors for us, whether it be for substance use, for eating disorders, for suicidality, chronic or acute, right? We're going to have a lot of those things happening because of how the world treats us. And one of the things that I always say, we talked about this, I think last time we had a mental health discussion, something that's really important to understand is that when the world doesn't want you to be alive, and when people don't want you to be around, and people don't want you to be honest with them about who you are, and people treat you like you're something else, it is fully rational and fully normal to be in crisis. Our society treats crisis and treats mental health situations and treats suicidality as if it's something that's completely irrational and abnormal, and that like it's not in response to anything. This person is just being nuts. But that's not the case, right? We have lived material conditions that we are constantly living through. And the more we place the blame where it belongs and not on the person, the better we'll have an understanding of how to actually care for people And caring for people means improving those material conditions first and foremost.
I feel like there's a real understanding between like misinterpreting causality and effect, if that makes sense or if I'm saying it correctly. Right, because it's like, oh, yes, you know, if you look at trans communities, huge rates of depression, huge rates of eating disorders, or, you know, substance abuse. And a lot of people, right, are getting it backwards. And I'm rephrasing, not just for myself, but for the audience as well, I'm hoping, and drawing like the line through the conversation, right? It's not that we're trans and so therefore we're prone to these things, but more that we're trans, we have material conditions and lived realities and are therefore pushed to those things. So trans didn't cause it, the effects of being trans and living in that world caused it. I kind of want to move on a little bit and talk about the importance of community for trans people and switch a little bit to the self-care portion, right? When we're thinking about protecting our own mental health, especially as we're already like halfway through the conversation, and I want to make sure that we're really hitting everything appropriately. So, you know, maybe in your own words, what is the importance of community for the trans and queer community themselves, like as a tool, right? As a tool to guard against your own sanity. Is it overrated, underrated? Is it not talked about enough?
I personally think it's necessary, but not as accessible in Connecticut as I would like it to be. I don't like, especially Eastern Connecticut, there's a lack of queer space. And queer spaces that do exist, many of them in this state, aside from New Haven Pride Center and Triangle Community Center, are centered around like alcohol. And so I think a lot of people sort of struggle, like, how do I find queer space if you're someone that struggles with addiction, it's harder in this state.
Yeah. I mean, I guess think about anything that defines you very centrally, right, as a human being. Maybe like, I don't know, something as simple as imagine being the only person, like let's say you're cis, right? Like Elliot and Heather, don't try. But let's say that you're cis and you are the only person that you've ever met of your gender. Like that's wild. That would mess you up, right? And then like we move away, like say like you're the only person that you know who does what you do for a living. And everyone else does other things. Doesn't it mess you up? There's so many things that define us, so many like lived experiences that define us. And if you don't have anyone to connect with, especially if that lived experience puts a target on your back for marginalization or for discrimination or for abuse, and you don't have anyone to connect with over that, that's going to mess you up. So whether or not like, you know, having trans community is gonna like be a cure-all or whatever, it's not. Like we're weird, we're all like hurt people who like are not great at making friends a lot of the time. We also are there for each other all the time. We're passing around the same $20 back and forth, you know. And if I say that like, man, I don't want to go to the gym because like there's gonna be cis people looking at me, you know, I know that like my trans bro that I can talk to is going to get it and we're going to like work out together somewhere else. And I don't have to explain it the way that I did to one of my last therapists who was like, oh, it sounds like maybe you have some problems with your body. And I was like, yes, that is what body dysphoria means. I told you I have that. But like not having to explain basic things, it doesn't even mean that you have to connect over other stuff. And I would also encourage people when we're talking about minority stress to check out Dr. Rylan Testa's work, where he's done some studies around minority stress, and specifically around gender minority stress. And one of the things that he found was that one of the biggest resilience factors for trans people around mitigating trauma and mitigating the harm that society brings onto us is having trans community. And that was statistically found. So I would definitely look into his work.
I think there's such a trend. I'm going to come back to this again, under capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, towards individual solutions, right? Like that is kind of how all of our healthcare system is structured, individual therapy, like you make the change, even though you live in the society that you live in, like you take this medicine, it's all on you. But like these like self-care approaches that are really geared towards like you working out, drinking a glass of water, like doing yoga, like all of those are great, because we all have physiological needs that need to be met. But if your feelings of sadness and disconnection are coming from like this fundamental alienation from like other people who don't share your experience, no amount of yoga is going to make you feel better unless you like actually connect with other people who like understand you and love you for who you are. So go out, touch grass, hold hands, find friends.
Oh, I want to make that the name of my first album because I'm a rock star.
Well, and I think I think as a mental health provider, I think that's one area that we do people disservice. It's not just about like, oh, go attend a support group. It's literally find community that affirms you. And also, there's something to be said for the negative impact on mental health of working at an employer that is less than affirming, to say the least. There's employment laws, but again, it's an access issue. The potential to be able to sue an employer for discrimination, and what's that impact as someone who's already disenfranchised, then seeking other employment, that kind of labels you.
Yeah. And like I think something that shocks me is like the amount that people don't think about. Elliot, you asked if it was undervalued. I think it's either undervalued or underconsidered, because I would say firmly that anytime I've spoken to somebody who has a family member or a friend or a child or whatever partner who's trans, and like they've been like, help me, my partner, friend, loved one, child is very sad and trans. And the first question that I ask them is, do they have trans friends? And 95.8% of the time, the answer is either no or I don't know. And then there's a lot of like confusion about like, why is that my first question? And it's like, well, like, let's see if they make trans friends, and like, let's see how much of a difference you'll see immediately. And a lot of the time there is a difference, but like the amount of surprise that people have around that is, that's always been flabbergasting to me. But yeah.
That makes perfect sense though, because right, you were all talking about how a lot of the emphasis, is we are going to, treat you uniquely and individually. You go on this medication if you're on depression, or you take these walks to make sure you get up in the morning, or you have this routine, but it's all orienting yourself right towards the world. It's not trying to orient the world to you, which is kind of how I think of community, because you are taking a step to actively build what your lived reality is, what your material everyday interactions are. And that's basically the same thing. It's just taking the power and reversing where it's going. I feel like that was not the best wording, but I hope that made sense to y'all. I suppose thinking of, clinical mental health care and affirmation, um, those two have always been at odds in the history of the society that we live in. And I was wondering how you all see the role of mental health providers when they're supporting trans people, and what are the best possible practices, each within your respective fields, right? What are the things that you would want to tell your colleagues, right? This should be your absolute guide if you have any trans clients, or even if a friend is just asking you.
So, as a therapist, I think you have to think very critically about what the mental health system we have is and what it actually does. Um, our mental health system is largely on an outpatient day treatment programs. They're largely based on the idea of group therapy. Now, if you're going to take someone who's queer and put them in a room of cis people, what's that impact? Then, like, not just queer, but trans, and then other identities. Like, if you're going to throw someone who has lots of marginalized identities in a room, how much is it helping people versus ostracizing them? And then there's the risk, right, of I don't know of a single person who has had a even like tolerable inpatient psychiatric hospitalization. I think people have an unrealistic view of what inpatient hospitalization can do within our medical system. It's there to keep you there until you say the words, "I'm not going to kill myself," and you leave. Like, I hate being blunt, but that's really where it's at.
We are here for blunt. No, absolutely. Don't feel bad about that.
So in summary, I think you need to make a plan, number one, to avoid hospitalization. That has to be your priority. And if there's any threat of that, you need to talk about that openly in therapy and make a plan with your therapist. How do we avoid hospitalization?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I don't have a lot to say on this because I think that the question was, if I understand it correctly, was geared towards people that have a very different power differential than like I would in my field. But I will say that I think that anyone with any amount of power, right, over a person, the way that a provider or prescriber has, needs to be very hyper aware of that power and needs to be able to talk about it openly in in session, like what Lauren was saying. If you are a mandated reporter in any way, shape, or form, you need to be very upfront about that from the very beginning of the therapeutic relationship. You need to say, what are the things that you can do or say that will force me to violate your bodily autonomy? And think about it that way and understand what that means. Because we are constantly indoctrinated with we have the responsibility to save people's lives. You're not. That's not what you're doing by forcing somebody to go inpatient. You're making them more suicidal, likely, as a byproduct of that. And that's something that we need to be aware of. And you're breaking trust. So we need to be very aware of that. I think constantly knowing that there's things that you need to learn, whether you're a peer support provider, whether you're any type of other provider. I think something else that we don't talk about a lot is going back to the material conditions. There's a sense of superiority and almost kind of like a patronizing sense that I see a lot of the time with mental health providers around for example, if a client is a few minutes late, I'm going to say that they're not committed to attending therapy or whatever, and after they're late a few times, I'm going to just stop seeing them without actually communicating with them, without checking if they're okay. You know, maybe your client has to take a bus. Maybe your client has 3 jobs where they're treated like shit, right? And they can't leave, otherwise they're going to be fired. Maybe your client is a parent. You're not thinking about those things, and like there becomes a very, very classist thing there as well. So yeah, just being aware of that, and also like learning from trans people specifically, and learning from trans professionals.
Yeah,
absolutely. And Lauren just noted too. I know we're getting close on time, so I kind of wanted to just at least put it out there, though. You know, also the inpatient hospitalization can jeopardize housing and employment, child custody, so many things. But Heather, did I cut you
gender-affirming
off?
care. Yeah,
And
Heather, go ahead.
So I think the last part that like you need to listen to the trans people, especially your patient, like because they are the expert of their own experience, right? Like that's the most important thing. I feel like sometimes I see this where like doctors will kind of capitulate to like the opposite end where it's like, oh, like you're trans, so like everything you experience in terms of difficulties must be filtered through this trans lens. And like sometimes people just have anxiety and like they might have also gender dysphoria, but like sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with it. They might also just have ADHD or depression. And if this person is telling you like this isn't that relevant right now, you can get super psychodynamic with them and be like, oh, maybe you're not ready to address it. But also like maybe they're right, you know, like, oh my God, what an idea. Maybe your patient is right. And then more specifically for doctors, what I hope that they know is like, you know, you've already learned a lot through medical school and training. There are specific like treatments that your patients are going to be on that are going to have interactions with certain medications, like whether it's psychiatric or neurological medications or hormones. And hormones and Lupron and other gender affirming care can have like other sequelae and side effects. So like as a good medical provider, like you should be knowledgeable about these, and your patient should not have to educate you. Like that is part of your job. You know, trans, intersex people, like non-binary people are, you know, a greater than like 2% of the population, like more for younger folks. If you wouldn't consider like say autism spectrum disorder, like if you wouldn't consider that a subspecialty that you shouldn't understand, if you're a psychiatrist, like you should be equally informed about trans health topics. Like that's how prevalent these like your patients are going to be. So I hope people stop treating trans people as like a niche population that they can just ignore.
I love that comparison. Recently we also did a talk with Anunnaki Marquez, who shed a similarly enlightening statistic that, you know, as many redheads there are in the world, generally there are intersex individuals. And right when you put it in those terms, you know, if, you know, there is such a percentage of autistic, you know, patients, and then compared to trans, and you see the disparity of the focus between those two groups, it really shows you some of the underlying biases, whether they're conscious or not, of pathologizing things that shouldn't be, and disregarding things that you just don't want to deal with. We are in our last 10 minutes, and I kind of want to end on a good happy note. And so I was wondering, you know, what are some best practices you might recommend for those in the trans community? And I think even more broadly in the queer community too, especially if you're GNC, gender nonconforming, for taking care of your mental health, right? Because we've been mostly talking about the barriers, you know, and again, you shouldn't have to be the person that is at the forefront of the fight. But that is often the case. So maybe before it gets to that level, what are some steps beyond, what did you say, Heather? touching the grass, hugging people, and going outside, that you can employ. We all know we need to drink water, and we all know that a regular sleep schedule is a good thing. But, finding community, like we were talking about earlier, things like that. What would you say to someone who was looking for maybe some less always on the top 10 list of ways to feel better, specifically, right, for the community? I see the thought wheels turning and everyone's like,
I truly think being around other people, and sort of like knowing yourself, how you function well. Do you function better having roommates versus living alone? Are you, it's tough because that's how our society is organized. Like all the clinical texts, it's all around this individualistic paradigm, which is just, it's crazy. Talking to some friends from different parts of the world, they're like, well, why don't people just, this affects so many people. Why is this a question of whether or not to get more education? It's I would say don't try fad diets, because there's a reason the diet industry is profitable.
No tummy tea.
Yeah.
But I'm also hearing you say like a certain amount of self-awareness too. We were kind of bonking or banging on, right, like the individualistic sense of how the mental healthcare institutions frame their own treatment. But when we're taking care of ourselves, self-awareness, I do think, is kind of like the name of the game. Because if you know your own, triggers, what's not necessarily in such an extreme word, but what's uncomfortable, right? Just like you were saying, live alone, live with roommates. That is a big thing because you can avoid a lot of stress without it ever coming up to begin with.
And I also think, it's important for us to be aware of sort of what our sensory palette is. Little tiny things like if you're very sensitive to noise and you notice noise makes your anxiety worse, put oh my God, earplugs in sometimes at night. Like that's a simple little thing, because part of it's about making it like accessible too. So if something makes you feel mindful, a simple thing I do with people all the time is those little tiny metallic stars. I'll tell them to just put them in little places. And when you see it, just like take a breath. Our society's so focused on productivity. I try to invite people to take a step back from that and sort of say, like, is productivity your value or what society wants you to hold as a value?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to jump right off that point because I think that's really key, especially for a lot of people that I see, patients that I see for like depression, where things just feel meaningless. You can't find the motivation to do things. Things aren't enjoyable. Or just kind of like, if you're just a regular person and you're experiencing some sort of like existential dread, I mean, who could blame you? But like finding something where you genuinely feel like it gives your life meaning and you enjoy doing, and it helps you see that you have some sort of power in the world, preferably like in acting in concert with other people so that you also have a sense of community. Like find whatever joy in that you can and devote whatever time you feel like you can to it, because like we're not here to just punch the clock and just to feel like we're here to survive. Like your life really does have to have some sort of meaning in it, and you kind of have to create it yourself.
That's also valuing yourself too, though, in a way, which I don't think is a way it's put often, because inherently, if you're doing something you enjoy, then you're saying, well, I matter enough to do something I enjoy. And I feel like a lot of people who are in the kind of rat race productivity line are maybe not having the best self-esteem, because it's like, well, it doesn't matter what I want. I am here for others' needs and actions. I'm sorry, Kirill. I know this is kind of last question, and I want to give you space to also talk.
No, it's all good. You're all saying like really helpful things. I think I like maybe maybe I want to approach it from a slightly different angle. A lot of the time, in my experience, working class trans people feel very disconnected from a lot of like the um, self care type of concepts. Even what we were just talking about right now, which is completely true. And people should internalize the fact that their life should not revolve around like, being productive and so forth. But that person I described earlier who has to work 3 jobs or be out on the street is not going to be like, I'm going to take care of myself today and not go into work and get fired and be out on the street. Right. So we need to be very realistic. And in a similar vein, I think we need to stop beating ourselves up for not feeling good, or not, not finding that self care, like doodads, like don't help us feel good. So a lot of the time when I work with people in the community, we talk about like what helps you feel slightly less shitty. The good is not the objective. The objective is like, how do we mitigate these very unjust things that are happening to us and the impact that they're having on us? And a big part of that is putting the blame where it belongs. Because a lot of the time, right, going back to the rat race and the productivity, we are taught, one of the first things that we're taught is that any time something bad happens to us is because we didn't try hard enough, is because we're not good enough, and because we didn't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and tie ourselves into a pretzel for somebody else's profit, right? And that especially gets compounded so much more when you're a trans person and when you are dealing with so much stuff on top of that. So one of the first things that we like to think about is like, where am I placing the blame? Am I placing the blame on myself when it doesn't belong there? And am I judging myself too harshly for my coping mechanisms, right? Am I angry with myself because I, went and ate 3 bags of potato chips instead of what I read in the self-help, self-care article, where I should take a walk and breathe and have 3 glasses of water instead? And so not only like am I feeling crappy because of what happened to me, I'm also now additionally feeling crappy because my coping mechanism is somehow bad, or I'm sad instead of feeling at peace with myself. Or the best thing that I can do instead of feeling sad is feel angry at the world. And I consider feeling angry at the world and feeling that very negative feeling, or, even not getting worse, a win. So like just being really gentle with yourself and like don't judge yourself for the things that you need to do, because the world is messed up. The world doesn't treat us fairly, and we got to do what we got to do, whatever those things are.
Absolutely. I feel like, we could keep having this conversation, Heather, yes, taking the middle path and a bag and a half and then a cup of water. Or, Lauren, like you said, acknowledging that doing the best you can for that day is good enough. Perfection and the rat race have this weird symbiotic relationship that should not be. But we are at time, and I want to thank you all for having this conversation with me. Honestly, letting me listen. This is not something that I am naturally good at understanding, and so along with the audience, I think it's something that's incredibly important to know, especially for the trans community, especially right coming up to TDOR. This is a hard time for all of us. This week has been really helpful and illuminating for many people in our community, learning about how to support people, but it's also good to know how to support ourselves when we're going through such difficult times and daily and chronically. So closing up, I feel so lucky to be part of the New Haven Pride Center and participate in conversations like this. I want to remind everybody watching, the center is here for you year round with dynamic programming, support services, case management, a food pantry, a gender affirming closet. We have binders, we have wigs, we have eyelashes, super comfy t-shirts and jackets, blankets. So art exhibits, so much more. Honestly, a lot of the time I can't remember everything because there's always so much going on. Controlled chaos.
Do you do referrals for mental health stuff?
We also do referrals for mental health as well. If you're looking for somebody in particular, we have our own lists for Connecticut area specific. You know, you want a trans specific therapist, I have you covered. You want someone with a different kind of specialty, we can definitely do that too. Voice therapy referrals as well, a lot of stuff. So if you're looking for anything like that specifically within trans programming, you can contact me at the email below, trans@newhavenpridecenter.org. You can also find out about all of our upcoming events. Go to newhavenpridecenter.org. It has a list of events. Homepage on the left-hand side is our calendar. You can also make an appointment to access all that great stuff I mentioned earlier by emailing Juan Carlos, JC Costa Soto. I can't read the screen. Yep, at newhavenpridecenter.org. Also, be sure to follow us on social media. Honestly, that's the best way to see a lot of stuff because no one remembers to check a website so often. So follow us on Facebook at New Haven Pride Center. Follow us on Instagram at New Haven Pride Center. And on Twitter, we're New Haven Pride. Something I want people to keep in mind as well. We have an entire YouTube channel that has archived all of our past panels, conversations, and everything like that. So if you see something upcoming that you wish you could go to, but you have work, it will be on there later on. You can go to youtube.com/C/New Haven Pride Center. Everything is there. Today's conversation will be there if you only caught the last bit of it or the first bit, depending when you're watching. If you have any concerns, comments, questions, whether you're looking for resources or a parent looking for some direction, you can contact the Pride Center in general at info@newhavenpridecenter.org. And lastly, as a pro tip, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider joining as a member. It's completely free. More so, if you're interested in supporting our work, we are a community run by and for the community nonprofit. We rely on donations from viewers such as yourself. We rely on grants that let us continue doing these amazing kinds of programs. So if you go to newhavenpridecenter.org/donate, you can fund a conversation just like this, or a smaller donation can help bring food to somebody. You can see a full breakdown actually of what your donations actually equal out to on our website. So thank you so much for joining us for today's panel. Thank you to our panelists. I wish we could continue the conversation for my own selfish reasons as well, because I need more tips and tricks, please. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you so much.